So since Andrew introduced this image, I thought I'd go with it. What I'm going to talk about is how Spark helps inventors get through the valley of death. And with that, hopefully, I can give you some insight into the way Spark works. Okay, this is the drug development process. To be clear, Spark does not just work on drugs. It works on drugs, biologics, and devices, but this is the most well-proven or the most familiar process. So if you start over here on the left, you have discovery, and then you work your way through target validation, process chemistry, then you get into the clinic, okay? Phase 1, 2, 3, and then product approval. Now, before the meeting today, I did a check in the room, and I was assured myself that there was a Spark advisor from every one of those areas in the room today. So, in case anybody develops a sudden urge to develop a drug, we can take care of you today. All right, here's where Spark focuses. In this early area, just out of discovery. So guys like Steve Schau get involved early on back there in the chemistry stage. And you'll work all the way forward. So the guys like Ted McCluskey are watching because he's a clinical guy. And he's looking back at what's going on in the early stages saying, wait a minute, are you making the right decisions? Are you generating the right data to set us up so that we can run a good clinical program? And then we have Carol Karp, who's sitting technically out on the far end as a regulatory person, but actually is looking all along the spectrum to make sure that everybody's doing what they need to do to be able to meet regulatory requirements. Okay, so why does the dotted line stop there at preclinical development? It's because that's all the money, that's all we can afford. Now, if we had more funds, we could afford to go forward. If we had more funds, we could afford to go forward. I want to make that point very clear. But we don't. So most of our work stops by the dotted line there. And then what we have to do is begin the begging phase at that point. And Kevin is terrific at the begging phase. So one way or another, you'll see that there have been Spark projects that have moved into the clinical phase. A lot of them have. But that's through a lot of really good work, and it's because all of the work that preceded that was of such good quality. Okay, how do investors look at the valley of death? Well, this is the way they look at it. You have a bunch of academics over here that throw a whole bunch of money and resources into a pit and nothing ever comes out. Now, everybody knows that on the far side of that is the pharma industry. And depending on the pharma company, they will be bringing in from 50 to 70% of their total portfolio from in-licensed products, like ones coming from academia that have made it through the valley of death. So it's important to them, but we have to be able to create a product, meaning a data package, that is something that they will be interested in investing in based on the risk they're looking at based on the data that we've generated. Okay. All right, so what makes, you heard from Andrew Lowe that Spark has been quite successful at this. Well, so the question is what makes Spark successful? And the answer is we think backwards, seriously. Okay, what does that mean? When I say we think backwards, it's because we think first about, or we keep in mind, keep in front of ourselves constantly the idea of what does the funding entity want. And it says investors in quotes, and that means it could be early stage VCs, it could be corporate venture groups, it could be other types of funding entities. But the question is the question we always think about is, what do they want? Well, the first thing they want is a product that provides value to not just patients, but also the physicians and the payers. And that paradigm has shifted. We used to just think about patients and maybe physicians and not so much about payers, but in today's world, Duchenne is a perfect example. You have to satisfy the payers. If you don't satisfy the payers, the product's not going to go anywhere. So that's one of the original things that everybody in the Spark program thinks about when they look at a project. Two is there is no fast and inexpensive path for the development of any of these products. But what we need to do is come up with ways to make that path relatively fast and inexpensive. Three, we look at a variety of different kinds of projects. And when you get into the biologics, this becomes really a big deal. You have to have relatively straightforward manufacturing. If not, product's just not going to go anywhere. Next, ready for IND enabling studies, and that, within the constraints of the limited, very limited resources of the Spark program, becomes really difficult. But it's a requirement we have to meet. Next is really strong animal proof of concept results. Those results are going to be torn apart by whomever is going to do subsequent funding of the project. And those results have to stand up to incredible scrutiny. So everybody along the way is thinking all the things they need to do to make sure that that trial in the animals is as good as possible, because that's your best evidence of what's likely going to happen when you take that huge jump to phase 2 trials in humans. Okay. Now this is fairly new because of the papers that came out showing the difficulty in translating your discoveries in academics over to the pharma companies after they'd licensed the products. Pharma companies on the front end of every deal these days are saying, first, transfer your technology to us. And I can tell you from personal experience, that is incredibly more difficult than you would think, because things will go wrong with that transfer that you would never guess. And I can't talk about that a lot, but I can tell you things that you would never think about have to be held constant as you make that transfer. And when they're not, that's where you get the belief that these transfers cannot be made. They can, but you can't leave anything to chance. Okay, last is preferably the discoveries based on a clinically validated target. Okay, that can be a whole lot of different things. So it can be a derivative of a drug that we know that works in sight. It can be another drug that hits the same target. It can be a drug that hits a pathway for which there are genetic abnormalities that lead to a certain outcome, and you're affecting that pathway. So it can show up in a variety of different ways. But that's the holy grail that everybody's shooting for today, and as we go forward, that's what's going to be expected of the projects that come through academic research. Okay, now I'm going to tell you some stories to illustrate the way Spark works. The first is I'll talk about a drug combination product for a disease called hyperhidrosis. That one's not even in Spark, but it was Spark inspired. The next one is a, quote, eardrop for the treatment of chronic tympanic membrane perforations. That was funding of an instructor and his team here at Spark. The third is a topical product for skin pigmentation disorders, and that's Spark funding of a team of students. Okay, now, a couple of points. First, obviously there are the direct effects of Spark that we've all seen today. There are indirect effects of Spark that are important. The first project up there I'll show you is an example of that, how Spark influenced things happening outside the walls of Stanford. Two is Spark doesn't just fund professors. They fund everything from Nobel laureates to students. So that's an important thing that you need to understand. All right, let's start going through stories. This is primary focal hyperhidrosis. This is overactivity of the eccrine sweat glands. It can manifest in a variety of different ways. You have the axillary form, the palmar form, the plantar form, and the generalized form. 70% of the people that have hyperhidrosis have a mix of all of those. It affects about 4% of the Western population, about double that in Asian populations. There are no good treatments. There's one approved treatment, which is Botox injections under the arm, about 60 injections under the arm. It's really expensive. It hurts. You have to go back to the doc every 4 months. Nobody's happy with any treatment for hyperhidrosis. Okay, so here's the story behind this product. Starts with Kevin. When Kevin was a young man, he wrote a review paper on hyperhidrosis. That review paper is considered to be the best review paper in the dermatology field for hyperhidrosis. It brought awareness to the disease. It brought awareness especially to the fact there's no good treatments. Okay. Then it goes to Kevin and Daria, who believe in the potential value of combination drug products. Okay. Then it goes to me. I was asked to go be chairman of a company that had combination drug product technologies. Okay. So I put all that together and came up with the idea, well, if sweat glands are innervated by muscarinic receptors, let's give a muscarinic antagonist. You think, okay, that's straightforward. No, it's not. So the problem is there's 5 muscarinic receptors, and nobody really knows which muscarinic receptors innervate the sweat glands in humans. I can tell you one thing, it's not the same muscarinic receptors that innervate the sweat glands in a rat. We learned that the hard way. Okay, so figure that piece out. So amongst the spectrum of any muscarinic drugs, we chose one that did have activity. The problem then is that nobody would take it because these drugs are horribly intolerable. 80% of the people will be off those drugs in the first few weeks, most notably because of the dry mouth. So the solution was, let's go the combination drug product route. We'll add a muscarinic agonist, to which everybody would think normally, all right, you're just going to cancel everything. Nope. Doesn't work that way because the muscarinic agonist we use hits preferentially different receptors. And the receptors on the sweat glands, the muscarinic receptors, are different than the muscarinic receptors in the salivary glands. Okay, so if you're still with me, here we go. We take a muscarinic antagonist and we add to that a muscarinic agonist. The muscarinic antagonist is a medium half-life drug. The muscarinic agonist is a short half-life drug, but part of the trick is we also have to move out the peak blood level of the muscarinic agonist so it matches that of the antagonist, so you're getting your maximum antagonism when you're getting your maximum peak blood levels. Okay, great idea. So what happens when you go in the clinic with this? Well, it turned out that we're able to get reduction in side effects. We got a significant reduction in dry mouth. In fact, we got a big reduction in all side effects, which surprised everybody. That's interesting. That's good. That makes it a good product, likely. But importantly, we didn't reduce the efficacy of the muscarinic antagonist, and we used 3 different measures to assess efficacy. So we feel good about the validity of those results. That product or that study was chosen for presentation at the late breaking session of the American Academy of Dermatology and was presented 2 weeks ago. All right, so that's an example of Spark having an influence outside of the walls of Spark. This is a perforation of the tympanic membrane, and the chronic forms of those are the problem. The second most common reason people go to see a physician is because of otitis media. Common complication of that is perforations. About 1 to 3% of the population will develop perforations. No big deal. They heal spontaneously. The problem is about 12% of those perforations become chronic. Once they become chronic, they're not going to change. When they don't change, you can lose your hearing and you have direct access to the middle ear, which is not a good idea. Okay. The treatment for that is surgery. That surgery hasn't changed materially in the last 100 years. Nobody's happy with it. Okay? So Spark got involved. The story there is there was an Australian physician who was in his ENT program who would go out to the Aborigines populations and he would see all these kids that had chronic perforations of their eardrums. Really frustrated that no way he could do anything for them out there. So he became so concerned about it, he came back, went to graduate school, got his PhD in molecular biology of the tympanic membrane. That's commitment. Then he finished his ENT program, came to Spark, presented the idea. Spark funded him. The first thing he did is to develop a model. if you don't have a model, you can't develop a product. So you developed a model of chronic tympanic membrane perforation. The second thing he did was figure out what protein allows for growth of the tympanic membrane. Figured that one out. And then he hooked up with delivery people from the orthopedics group who had a polymer delivery system so that he could put that protein into what would be a liquid first. It would flow into your ear, turn into a solid, stay there for about a month, deteriorate away, and when it deteriorated away, the perforation was healed. Pretty cool. Okay, so this is what he came up with. It's basically an eardrop alternative to this complicated, expensive surgery that nobody likes. It's a single administration, obviously a lower cost, greater convenience and acceptability than the surgery. A product like this has been called the greatest advance in otology since the cochlear implant. And this product is now in a development partnership with a multinational pharma company. Okay, third, this is vitiligo. It's obviously a pigmentation disorder. This occurs in about 1% of the world's population. That's a lot of people. Obviously, you go into certain segments of the population or different populations of the world, it's even at a higher rate. There is no good treatment for vitiligo. All right, this is the idea from the team that Spark sponsored, which is an approach that had been tried in vitiligo is to take a peptide, MC1R agonist, administer it subcutaneously, and then give phototherapy, which is prolonged UV light, which of course sets you up for skin cancer, which is not a good idea. So there's nothing that is a good treatment. This was something that was tried. It actually failed in a clinical trial. But the idea of this team was to come up with a small molecule MC1R agonist, which they did. That stimulates melanocytes, which will then give you the skin pigmentation that you want. Now, I am very happy to announce that that team won the Stanford Innovation Project Award last week. And that team is here somewhere. And I don't see Aaron, but I know that, oh, you're over there. Stand up. Terrific. That is a dedicated team. Okay, and now they have some money. Thanks to Kathy. $200,000 to further their research. People in these Spark programs work for their money. Okay, all right, last point. Why do Spark advisors participate? Everybody asks me that all the time, and here are your answers. One, it's not the food. Yes, Daria feeds us before every meeting, but that is not the reason. Actually, I was talking to one Spark advisor and asking this question before we started, and I said, so why don't you do it? He said, because my wife told me to get out of the house. She needed some more time. Okay, everybody has their own reasons, but I'm just going to put up what I think are important reasons. One is this is what we like to do. We've dedicated our life to developing products, and this is what we like to do, so when we come here, we get a chance to do it. Two, we like the challenge and the learning. We're addressing the valley of death. I mean, how can you work on something more challenging than something called the valley of death? Okay, then the other aspect of that is on the learning side. The people you've seen today, the people that present, the inventors and the investigators are brilliant people, and you learn a lot from them. Also, from the Spark advisors, you learn an enormous amount from them. It's a great place to learn. So people love that. And I know some of you from other Spark programs around the world, okay, here is going to be your issue. Your difficult challenge is we like the Spark culture and the community. That's something, the culture is something created by Daria and by Kevin, and it's going to be incredibly difficult for you to replicate, just to be very straightforward about this. It's a terrific culture. It's no BS, no egos, everything like that gets checked at the door. Everybody's here to do a job and get it done well and get along with everybody else. That's the culture. Everybody plays by the rules. If you can imagine being able to go to work every day in a culture like that, you could see why people like to come here and participate in the Spark program. Also, it's a bunch of good people. So the community aspect of it all is really important. Okay, last point there is just their Spark advisors. Everybody who's a Spark advisor has a gold thing on their badge. Grab one of them and say, you know, so why do you do this? And they'll all have other reasons, but it'll be insightful for you to ask. Okay, last point. I'd like to thank everybody that's been involved. Kevin gave you a sense of the breadth of people that have been involved and are required to make this successful. It's a huge number of people, including lots of you out there. Thanks to all of you for 10 good years.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.